Before we start, why don't we have a word of prayer? Our dear, gracious, loving Heavenly Father, we thank you for another evening to talk about stewardship and your grace and your mercy towards us. And Lord, now as we get into the nuts and bolts of personal finance, we ask for your guidance, your wisdom, your blessing, and most of all, Lord, may it lead us to become better stewards to glorify you. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Okay, so tonight we're on session number 10, talking about credits and loans. And tonight is going to be a very practical discussion, and it's going to draw upon the collective wisdom of everyone here. So, this is going to be very interactive. But before we do that, I want to back up and do a little review so that we can get a running start, because it has been a while since our last session. So, does everyone remember this? Okay, so what we did back in session 4, I believe, is we looked at the various phases of life, right? You start out as a single, independent person, and then you get married, and it's just you and the wife, and ideally speaking, right? And then, and then you have kids. Those kids grow up, you get to high school, college, and of course, college is a huge phase, okay, for the kids and the family. And then the kids graduate, they get married, they have their own family, and they move away. And at that point, you become empty nesters. And after you reach, the 60s or so, you decide to retire. And that's when you enter the last phase of the financial life cycle, which is retirement. Now, as we were looking at all of that, we asked the question, what should compose your personal financial plan? Okay, because when you don't have a plan, what's the saying?
If you fail to plan.
If you yeah, does it say it one more time?
If you fail to plan, you
plan to fail. If you fail to plan, you plan to fail. So the idea was, okay, we have to have a financial plan for our families. So what composes the components of such a plan? And we looked at 9 things. And we looked at assets, right? So you need to have an asset plan. And the idea there is you want to be able to build wealth over time, okay? And then you want to be able to live off those assets in your retirement years. And whatever's left over, you can leave as a legacy to your children or to ministry, ideally both, right? And the idea is you're giving a gift to the next generation. Okay, so that should be your overall asset goal. Now, number 2, in order to do that, you would need to have a budget to control the cash flow. Okay, and the cash flow is looked in terms of income and expense. And this past Sabbath, we looked at it in terms of the human circulatory system and the blood flow, right? Perfect health depends on perfect circulation. That's true with blood flow. It's also true with cash flow in the household economy. Okay, and then we looked at savings. From the budget, we get savings, and we use that savings now to fund an emergency fund, which ideally should be how much? 3 to 6 months of living expenses, right? And then anything in excess of that, we use as seed money for future purchases. We use some of the savings to pay off debt, and we use some of the savings to fund investment. So basically, it's your savings that drives everything, really. Okay, we're going to get more into this a little bit later. Then we have a debt plan. The idea is to eliminate debt and then deal wisely with credit and necessary loans. And then when we move from here to here, investment, we want to invest now to produce future income, right? Especially for retirement, which are the years that you're not working. Okay, and then now that you've amassed all of these assets, you need to protect them, because anything can happen, right? Calamity, accidents, and that's why you have to have an insurance plan. And then, of course, you have to deal with the government and taxes, right? There's two things that are sure in this life: death and taxes, right?
Unless you plan to be translated.
Exactly, unless you're the last generation. And then when you deal with all of that, as you enter the sunset years, you want to do estate planning. And in fact, estate planning should start much earlier than retirement. This is where you make arrangements for when you die or become incapacitated. And that can happen at any time. So even someone as young as Christian should already, he's the youngest guy here. How old are you, Christian? 27. I am so glad you're here. And you're how old? 14, right? I am so glad you're here. Technically, you're the youngest one here, which is good because you're learning all of this ahead of time, which will prepare you for the future. Okay, and then lastly, all of these things require documents. And so what you want to do is have a system to keep all this information organized and accessible. The last thing you want to have happen is if an accident occurs, and all of a sudden you need, to provide documentation for things, power of attorney, advanced health directives, and all of a sudden you're like scrambling going, I don't know where to find this stuff. That's really hard, right? So you want to have it organized and very accessible. Okay, so we basically went through these. Now what we're doing in these sessions now is we're going through these step by step. Okay, so we went through, when we did the balance sheet, we actually covered asset plan number 1. If you recall, we looked at the accounting equation. Everyone remember this one? Okay, so your total assets, or your assets are your total wealth. Okay, your total wealth is composed of two components. It's either wealth that you own or wealth that you borrowed. Okay? And the idea here is your asset plan is to grow your wealth. And you can do it by earning more money or also borrowing money. Because you can act rich without being rich, right? And the way you do it is by doing this, right? So what we found is in stewardship, according to God's plan, liability is not really His plan for us. What He wants us to do is increase our equity. We have to have dominion. Remember the 2 stewardship principles? Have dominion over the earth, okay? And that means getting out of slavery. If you're going to have full dominion, you're going to be in charge, you can't be slave to someone else, okay? Now, in order to increase your assets, or sorry, your equity, what powers that is actually your savings. Okay, so this brings us to the other equations we covered in our series. So what is the definition of savings? Do you remember? Okay, the definition of savings is your income minus your expense, right? So what we saw is, if your savings is going to increase, the way to do it is to increase your income and decrease your expense. Right? Make sense? Okay. Now, as you do that, your equity increases, which means the value on this side of the equation also increases. Okay? By the way, does anyone have any questions? Oh, pretty clear. Okay, so that's a review of the asset plan. And then number 2, because it's the savings that drives everything, and savings is a function of income and expense, well, the way we increase savings is through having a budget. And after we've created savings through the budget, that's when we can fund the emergency fund, the future purchases, extra payments on debt, and make investments. And now we're pretty much here. Okay, we're on the phase to eliminate debt and deal wisely with credit and necessary loans. Now notice I say necessary loans, because the idea is you generally don't want to have loans at all. But there comes time, particularly here in Hawaii, where unless you have $600,000, $700,000 in cash, you're going to have to take out a mortgage if you want a house. Okay, it's kind of one of those necessary evils. So, here's the idea. We want to eliminate debt, right? We're going to talk about the mortgages as a second part, but how do you eliminate debt? It all starts here. You increase your income, decrease your expense, and that increases what? Your savings. When your savings increases, it increases your equity. Okay, now you take some of that equity, okay, as your equity is increasing, your assets are increasing, but you're taking a portion of that savings and you're now using it to pay down your liabilities. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so now we looked on Sabbath morning at how to pay down debt. We looked at two methods we learned from the book of Acts and Pentecost. Does everyone remember that? Mm-hmm. So we looked at the debt snowball and the debt avalanche. Okay, so technically, let's say in this example, you owe $41,000 in debt, and now that you have savings, you're taking that savings and you're throwing it at the debt. But how would you proceed? You know, how would you go about doing that? Well, of course, we saw that the debt snowball starts with ordering your debts according to the smallest balance and moving to the largest. The debt avalanche, on the other hand, starts with the highest interest rate and moves to the lowest. Both of them work. We saw that this provides more momentum. You tend to gain victories quicker, and it keeps you motivated. But you end up paying more interest in the long term. This one, you end up paying less interest total, but your victories are kind of farther out. So people tend to get a bit more discouraged using this method. So most people opt for this one. Okay, everybody remember that? Yeah. All right, so let's go back. The ideal situation now is you've paid off your debt. It's all gone. How are you building wealth now? The liabilities falls out of the equation. And now you have assets equals your equity. Okay? Because you paid out all your debt. So your income is increasing, your expense is decreasing. That means your savings increases, which means your equity is increasing. And if your equity is increasing, your assets are increasing. And this is the way God wants us to build wealth. Make sense? Amen? Okay, any questions? All right. So, now, we talked about eliminating debt through the debt snowball and the debt avalanche. But, in real life, we're going to have to deal wisely with credit and necessary loans. Unless someone has given you a big chunk of money and you don't have to deal with any credit or any loans, you're of the privileged few. But the majority of us will have to deal with this in our lifetime. So, that brings us now to our session today. Credit and loans are practical considerations and discussion. Was the review helpful? You know where we are in the running of things? Alright, so tonight, our discussion topics. We're going to talk about the definitions of credit and debt. We're going to talk about good debt versus bad debt. Then we're going to look at general advice for borrowing. Then we're going to cover the FICO score and your credit history. Then we're going to look at how to use credit cards properly. And then we're going to look at mortgages and other big loans. And then if there's time, we'll tackle using debt for investment financing. Okay, I'm just curious, do any of these topics, any particular one, strike a chord with someone? Is there one of these that you are particularly interested in? If I were to ask you, I mean, all of it I'm sure you're interested in, but is there any particular one where you really want to know the most about?
Good debt, bad debt.
Good debt and bad debt, okay? Okay.
And big loans.
Same. And the big loans. Okay.
Debt for investment financing.
Debt for investment financing. Okay. What's that? FICO score. All right. Okay, so that covers just about everything. The whole thing. All right, let's do it. Let's start. Definition, and this is where we're going to be interactive. Definition of credit and versus debt. Can someone venture? Yes, Mike.
Okay, credit is basically what organization is willing to lend you, and then debt is what you actually owe on that credit.
Yes, absolutely correct. Your credit is actually your eligibility to borrow. Okay? And your debt is what you actually borrow. Now, as Christians, we should have excellent credit, but very low, if any, debt. Okay? If you have actually, it's funny because, yes?
However, in the society we live in, if you have no debt, the chances of you actually having credit, good credit, is really low because you're an unknown. And someone who has bad credit will actually have more credit than you will if you have no credit. Because an organization is willing to gamble more on a person who has bad credit than no credit.
Okay, that brings up a good point. Does everyone understand what he means?
Yeah.
In other words, you need debt to
establish credit.
Okay, but you need credit to get debt.
Right.
It's kind of like, you know how they say, if you want a job, you need experience. But in order to get experience, you need a job. This is kind of... Okay, is there a way to build up credit without using debt?
Yes.
Yes.
There is. But let's first talk about, okay, so credit, does everybody get it? Credit is your ability to borrow, okay, and debt is what you actually borrow. And what's interesting is, when you look at how they evaluate excellent credit, they're actually doing a stewardship check on you. It's really interesting because it's actually a test of character, I realized.
You know, that makes sense, because you look at the people who are honest about, especially their student loans, those are the ones that are serious about their relationship with God and with other people.
Right, and we're going to see on the FICO score how your financial habits are sized up in order to derive the score. So it's actually, they're sizing you up as a steward, which is why I found it so interesting. But okay, is there a way to build up your credit without going into debt? Okay, we are going to cover that here. Okay, using credit cards properly. Okay, so hang on to that. Now let's cover number 2. We understand that the Bible discourages debt. So, is all debt bad? Okay, well, by definition, yeah, but good debt here is sort of permissible debt, as a temporary means of getting to your goals. Okay, in the end, all debt is bad, but temporary debt is actually can be a good way of establishing wealth if you do it properly. Okay, so good debt versus bad debt. Who would like to venture a definition for these things? Anyone? Yes.
Okay, so good debt is debt that you're current on. You're making payments on it, at least your minimum payments. And then your bad debt is stuff that is below the line on your budget line you can't afford.
Okay, that's good. That's a very good definition. So your bad debt is stuff that you're not able to pay off when you're supposed to, your monthly payments, and then good debt is those that you are. Okay. Does anyone else have any thoughts? Was that a hand I saw? Yes.
I would say good debt is for necessary life expenses like college education.
Okay.
I would say, or an emergency you don't have savings for. And bad debt would be because you can't delay gratification. You just have to have something that you don't really need.
Okay. Very good. That's also pretty much part of the definition. Both of you are correct. Yes.
Good debt to me, it's something that you purchase that has a return of investment back to you over time. So like a car, if you're an Uber driver and you keep your car in good condition, maintain it, you can continue to draw income as a driver and still have a return of investment on your car that you spend on. Whereas bad debt is something that you take on, but it doesn't put money back into. There's no return of investment.
Right. Okay. Yes. Also good. Pretty much part of the definition. You're also correct. Tyler.
Pretty much same thing.
Same thing. Okay. By the way, all of you who are in the back, would it be okay if you kind of moved forward so that I don't have to keep gazing so far behind, these front people? Would you like to join us up here? So that we can, we're so close yet so far. It's sad.
Sad.
Okay. All of you are correct, actually. Now, good debt, if you think about it, is productive debt. It is actually debt that is spent on assets that appreciate in value. Okay? What do I mean by that? Well, I'll talk about it. But bad debt is money that is wasted, that doesn't produce return, and it's money spent on a depreciating asset. Okay. Appreciating and depreciating. What does that mean exactly?
Loses value.
It loses value. Depreciating assets loses value. Appreciating assets gain value. Okay. Can someone give me examples of both? Some were already mentioned. Yes.
So like if you buy a brand new car off the lot, as soon as you take it off and drive it home, you've already lost about $2,000, which you're still paying on. So that's a depreciating or a bad debt typically.
Yes.
Yeah, but not all depreciating assets are bad either, because you can write a lot of those off on your taxes
That's
too.
true. That's true, but you get more complicated in your sheet. And then an appreciating asset would be something like maybe you're buying a collector's item or a home, and you buy it in 2015 and it's worth $200,000, and then you're planning to sell it in year 2000, 2020 or something like that, and it's worth like $300,000. So you've appreciated the value of that.
Right. Okay. Now, bad debt is generally classed under the term consumer debt. It's money that you spend for, like you said, immediate gratification, and it doesn't produce a rate of return. Okay. Good debt appreciates in value, which means generally you'll have more money. When all is said and done and it's paid off, you'll have more money at the end than you did at the beginning. Now there are some iffy ones. Let's talk about a car. Because a car is one of those necessary evils, right? Okay. Is a car a good debt or a bad debt, or kind of both?
Both.
Kind of both.
It's kind of both. Okay, it's a good debt in the sense that, yeah, it's productive because you cannot produce income pretty much without it. You need to get to your job to produce income, but at the same time, it's a depreciating asset. So I'm going to give you an example. A depreciating asset produces a net loss, which means at the end of the loan, you're actually going to have less value than you did at the beginning. And you could end up in a situation where you are in an upside down situation. Have you heard that term before? What does upside down mean?
Because the value of your car is higher than what you actually
No.
The other way around.
Yeah.
That's why it's upside down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So-
Value
You owe
requires
more than
less
it's
what
worth.
you owe on it.
Yes.
Got it.
So here's a graph. Now, here's your car loan, okay, paid off over time. Okay, so they didn't give me a value, but let's just say it's a $24,000 car, okay? And you're financing that maybe over 5 years, okay? Depending on the car make and model, some cars depreciate, have low depreciation, some moderate, some very high. Now, what you have is there's a situation here where you're paying this much for the car, but like you said, as soon as you drive it off the lot, it loses value. So your car, let's just choose the low depreciation. So your car loses value. So you're in a situation where there's a gap here, where you're paying this much for the car, but the car is only worth this much. Okay, and that gap, depending on which car financing company you go with, sometimes they will require what is called gap insurance. What does that stand for? GAP. Okay, Guaranteed Automobile Protection is what it stands for. And what does it cover? If you are in an accident and you total the car,
Or the insurance
Okay.
gives you the value.
yeah, your regular car insurance will only cover a replacement vehicle. It won't cover the loan that you still have outstanding on the wrecked up car. Okay, so you get into the crash, your vehicle gets totaled, your regular car insurance gives you a new car, but you're still stuck with this loan. So the gap insurance will pay for that so that you don't have to. Okay, now notice what happens. Over time, this is the break-even point, where the value of the car is approximately the equal value of the loan. Okay, so when you get finished paying here, notice that your loan is lower than the value of the car, and this is pretty much where you gain value. But the problem is you paid this much for the car originally, and now at the end of the loan, where was it? Let's take this one. It's worth this much. So the distance from here to here is your net loss. And that's what's called bad debt. Because you borrowed money and it cost you more and you're stuck with something that's worth less. So you made a net loss. Okay, again, so in order to avoid this, what is the best option for buying a car, ideally speaking? Yes.
I used like 2 or 3 years old with low mileage.
You can buy a used car with low mileage, so basically the price is here. So originally it was here, you come down, the price of that car is here, and therefore you can skip this gap part. Okay, but what if you don't like used cars? Because see the problem I have with used cars is I'm not a mechanical kind of guy, and used cars tend to break down, they have all these things that you gotta repair, and I just hate dealing with that.
Sold as is.
Sold as is. So if I wanted to buy a brand new car, ideally, what is the best option?
Pay by cash.
Buy it cash. Depreciating assets are the assets you should pay cash for. Does that make sense? If you can. If you cannot, you can go the used car route, or you can go ahead and just try and find the best financing for your loan there and pay the car off as quickly as you can. The quicker you pay the car off, the less you have to worry about, right? And the less total interest you'll be paying. God bless you. Does anyone have any questions? Does that make sense? All right. So a house, when you buy a house, a similar situation, okay, a house generally will produce a net gain because property values tend to rise over time. So in fact, this thing would reverse. Like instead of this going down, it would go up like that, okay? And at the end of the loan, the value of the house will be up here, where the value of the loan will be here and this distance from here to there is a net gain. But you can also end up in an upside down position with a mortgage, depending on how the housing market goes. There was a crash in the real estate market not long ago, and there were people, particularly on the mainland, who found themselves with houses that were worth less than what their mortgage was. And at that point, they started doing short sales. And then when short sales didn't solve it, many foreclosed. And when you foreclose, basically you're pretty much defaulting on the loan. Okay? And that has its consequences. Any questions? Good discussion?
Yes.
Yeah.
Everybody seems so somber. Yes.
Well, one thing you have to remember about houses too, while they can go up in value, the older the house, the more maintenance it's going to end up requiring. So,
Yes.
like if you have a rental property, a house is considered a depreciating asset. You can depreciate the house, just not the land. So you have to figure out what the house's value is based off, or different from the land, because you can depreciate it on your taxes, but you can't depreciate the land.
Yeah, there are a lot of details and ins and outs to these things, many which are beyond me. But, I guess if you talk to the experts, they can help guide you through those, because what you're saying is true, for sure. All right, so next, we covered good debt and bad debt. So let's go to, another example of bad debt is, again, consumer debt. So you go out and you buy clothes, you go eat out, you do all this other stuff, you charge it onto a credit card, and you gotta pay it back. Okay, it's not productive debt. Okay, next. General advice for borrowing. The first piece of advice is don't borrow. The second piece of advice is if you have to borrow, this is the key word. Least. Borrow the least amount for the least interest for the least amount of time. Okay, regardless of what loan we're talking about, your key word is least. Okay, if you borrow the least amount with the least interest with the least amount of time, you really will not be spending a lot on the loan. Okay, so you're minimizing the cost of borrowing money. Now, if you want to get the most favorable terms, okay, and you want the least interest, that means you're going to have a really good credit score. Okay, a credit score is what is referred to as a FICO score. All right, now, the idea is there are people out there who are lending money, okay? But they want to know what kind of steward you are. Are you a credit-worthy, trustworthy steward who is, very likely to pay the loan back? Or are you a poor steward and you're likely to default and not pay back? Okay, well, they need a system to rank everybody, to rate everybody on your stewardship. So they produced credit scores. Now, the most popular credit score is called a FICO score. Does anyone know what FICO stands for?
Fair Isaac's
Yes. Company or corporation. Okay. FICO stands for the company who devised the score. Some guy with the last name Fair and some guy with the last name Isaac got together and started the Fair Isaac Company. And that's F-I and then C-O is company. Okay, so these guys developed a method of rating people's creditworthiness. Okay, now, what are the ranges of your FICO score? Okay, so it goes from 300, which is the lowest, to 850, which is the highest. Okay? And generally speaking, anything below a 580 is considered very poor. Okay? That means you are the highest risk of not paying your money back, the loan back. Okay? Then 580 to 669 is fair. Okay? 670 to 739 is good. 740 to 799 is very good. And then above 800 is exceptional or excellent. Okay? This means that you are close to 100% probability that you will pay the loan back. Now, if you're a lender, if you've got money in your pocket and you want to loan it to people, who are going to be the people that you are going to loan to first?
It depends.
These guys.
It depends on my risk tolerance.
Well, yeah.
Because I can charge the people with lower credit scores more money, more interest.
Right. Let's think about it from the viewpoint of a conservative lender. You're like, yeah, really risky lenders.
Called predatory lending.
Actually, side discussion while we're on it. The whole financial crash. How long ago was it? 2000.
3 years ago.
A few years ago, the whole financial crash. Case in point. The lenders had a lot of cash on their hands. The cash doesn't produce return for them unless they loan it out to people so that people pay interest. Okay? Everybody who wanted a loan, who was good, already had a loan. Lenders still had cash, so they loaned to these people. After that, they still had cash, so they loaned to these people. After that, they still had cash, so they loaned to these people. After that, they still had cash, so they loaned to these people. And these are what you call the subprime people. And the loans they gave them were called subprime mortgages. And when the subprime people defaulted on their loans, it created a ripple effect because everything else in the economy, right, is built on the exchange of money. If these guys can't pay back, then other companies who own the houses and stuff can't pay their bills, and it goes on until the whole economy defaults. That's what caused the financial crisis we just saw. And the reason why it was linked to the housing market was because it had to do with subprime mortgages, people who were poor stewards at managing their money. Just think about it, if everybody just did the biblical way, and they were all here, the economy wouldn't have collapsed. We would actually be prosperous right now. More so than before. Okay, so yeah, that was a digression. Good one. Okay. So now, let me ask, is there anybody here who has an 800 or above? Are you aware of your FICO score? Okay. And amen. Anyone else?
785.
Okay, 785, so you're in the very good. Okay. So the question is, if you're not here, how do you get here? Okay. If you're not in the excellent range, how do you get there? Now this is very good for our young people because you have time on your side, and what we're about to show you, ooh, you're going to love because it is the secret to you getting the best interest rate on the future mortgage that you're going to have on your house. Are you ready for this? All right. Yeah? Okay, here it is. What composes your FICO score? What factors go into creating this rating? Okay? 35% of your rating is based on your payment history. Okay? Your payment history is whether you're on time with your monthly payments. Okay? If you are late all the time and you accrue financing fees, this 35% of your score goes down. You do not want to pay your bills late, because even one late bill can really affect this. Trust me, I tried it just for fun. It's not wrong thing to do. It's like, I wonder what happens if I don't pay. Ding, it got dinged right there. Yeah, I was being dumb. Anyway, 35%. So, one of the best ways to make sure that you always pay on time is to automate your bill pay. But automating your bill pay requires that you need to have money in the bank all the time sufficient so that you don't have overdraft or bounced payment. Okay, and in order to make sure you always have money in the bank, you need to be running your budget efficiently. It all comes back to the B word, the budget, right? Okay. The next thing is your total amount of debt, which composes 30% of your score. Christian, can you get me a tissue again? I forgot the eraser. Oh wait, is this an eraser? Oh yeah, it is an eraser. Cool. Okay. Total amount of debt. How would they base that on? It's called credit utilization. What you do is you take all your credit limits. Say you've got Visa, MasterCard, Discover, American Express, okay? And you take the credit limit that each has a maximum of. So say that your credit limit on your Visa card, somebody give me a number.
5,000.
5,000. Okay, MasterCard. 1,500. Okay, 1,500. Discover card. The max you can borrow.
7,500.
7,500. 7,500. Okay, American Express. I guess you're leaving home without it.
Why not? You
Okay.
can't spend it anywhere.
Let's say,
Costco, that's about it.
yeah, Costco, okay. Well, let's just give you another 5,000. All right, add that all up. So, 5, that's 1,000. So 5, 6, 7, 7 plus 7, 14, 14 plus 5, 19,000. Okay? So let's just say that this is the maximum you can borrow from anybody, just as an example. So this is your total credit. Now, let's say that you start charging your cards. Okay, and let's say you did, out of all of this 19,000, you charged 2,000 here, 1,000 here, that's 3,000, 2,000 here, that's 5,000, 3,000 here, that's 8,000. So your, your debt is 8,000. Okay, what would be your credit utilization ratio?
You had to make it 19, didn't you?
Yeah. Okay, let's take something else. Okay, 18 times.
If you make American Express 6,000, it'll make it a nice 20,000, and then it's divisible by 5. And
Congratulations, we just raised your credit. All right.
oh, that's much better.
So now your total debt is 8,000 over 20,000. Can someone pull out your calculator and give me the
40%.
40%? Okay. So this would be 1 over,
That's multiplied by 5.
or 40% is what? What would the number be? 1 over So this would be 4? No.
2 over 5.
2 over 5. 2 over 5. Okay. So, how do we get the percentage? So, if 30% of your total debt accounts, let's do it this way.
So 10%
Law of proportions, right? I love it. I love it. Here we go. So, 30 points out of 100, right, would give you, am I doing that right?
So now
You want 30% of 8,000?
And
What are we trying to do?
part is on the top and the total is on the bottom, so 8,000 equals to,
Because 10% will be 800 times 3 is 240.
You know what, it's okay. You can go home and do this real quick. As you can tell, math wasn't exactly my strong point.
We're trying to do 30% of 8,000?
2,400.
2,400.
That's 30%.
30%. So,
Yeah.
what we're trying to find is
0.3 times 8,000.
the points out of 30 that this would translate to. Right? Log, are you with me?
Yeah.
Because 30%, so all of these numbers together add up to 100,
100. Got it.
right? So by law of proportions, we have to find out, okay, so what's 8, what's this? 8,
8 divided by 20, 8,000.
yeah,
I see what you're saying.
Yeah, 40%.
it's 40%, okay? So, here it is.
How do you do your GPA?
Okay, here we go. 40%, 40 out of 100 is equal to x over 30,
Yeah.
right? Law of proportions.
100x.
Kids are with me?
Yeah.
Right? Okay, yeah,
12
Nixie's
points.
smiling.
That's 12.
Okay, so cross multiplication. 100x equals
112.
1,200.
1,200. 1,200 divided by 100,
12.
x equals 12. So, if you use this much credit, out of 30 points, you would have 12 points. Are you with me? Make sense? Alright, so that's the way you calculate everything else. But it's not as clear-cut with the other things because they look into the length of your credit history, which is 15%. So in other words, okay, here they want to see your stewardship in terms of how you handle monthly cash flow. Here, they want to see your stewardship. So this has to do with your stewardship on the budget sheet. This up there has to do with your stewardship on the balance sheet. Okay, how much of your lifestyle is based on debt? If they see that much of your lifestyle is based on debt, why would they want to lend to you? Chances are you're going to squander the money. Next, they want to be able to see what you've been doing with the money that you've borrowed over the last X number of years. If you have a good track record of credit history, you get the full 15 points. Then they want to see the credit mix. So are you just using what is called revolving credit, which are credit cards? Or do you also have a car loan, a mortgage, student loans? Let's see how you fared with those. Okay, so that comes into the mix. And then the next is new credit. In the last few years, how much more credit have you applied for? And the reason why they're concerned about that is because the question is, why? Isn't your current credit enough? What are you doing that you need more credit? Okay, you factor all of those and you get a score that basically says whether you're a good steward or a bad steward. Normally I would kind of ignore this stuff and say, that's just man's concoction. Then I thought about it and I said, no, it's actually a godly number because it actually tells us how we're handling money, right? Okay, so think about all those things. Any questions? Any thoughts? Yes.
I just want to share, I like what Dave Ramsey said. He had mentioned that those with high credit scores shouldn't brag because that means you like debt. And that's not a good thing.
Right. Well, the thing is also, let's answer and go back to the question before, which is, can you build a good credit score without using debt? How do you do it?
Prepaid credit.
Exactly. What's prepaid? How does that work?
Your credit is based on how much you've given the organization that you're lending to you. So if I gave the bank $1,000, they'll lend me up to $1,000. That way, if I default, it's not really they're not losing any money.
Right. So the idea is, if you say you're a college kid, okay, college recruiters, these credit card companies are constantly recruiting on college campuses, okay? And generally when they do that, they give you this application and a free t-shirt and a Frisbee. I did it, right? And then they want, when you fill out the application, they want a co-signer, usually your parents. I forgot what verse it is in the Bible, but it says you're not supposed to do that. Do not be a surety for someone else's debt, even if it's your own kids. Okay. Instead, what you do is, if you're a college kid and you have allowance or your parents do give you something, take that cash, go to a bank or some institution that issues credit cards, and you basically get what is called a secured credit card. Okay, so like he was saying, your parents give you $1,000, take that $1,000 in cash, you go to the bank, you say, I'm giving you $1,000, issue me a Visa card that has a credit limit of $1,000. And then what happens is you go and you pay your bills with that credit card, and they see the transactions, okay, and then it's already, they already have the $1,000, so there's no risk in default, okay? You charge it up, and then you pay off the full amount at the end of the month. You keep doing this again and again and again. And eventually you develop a credit history of being good on your monthly payments, okay? And your total amount of debt, well, there really is none because it's all prepaid, okay? And as you do this, you develop a FICO score. And without going into debt, you can have a high score. And then once you have a high score, the banks will look at you and say, oh, you're a trustworthy steward. So we'll go ahead and give you a full credit card, okay, that's not backed by any deposit. And that's what you call an unsecured credit card, which is the regular kind. Make sense? All right. Any other questions? All right. Now, we looked at FICO score, credit history, how to use credit cards properly. Okay. Dave Ramsey says, don't have any credit cards at all. Okay. I'm not that extreme, okay, because, well, Dave Ramsey's Dave Ramsey. He's like the guru. So me, a normal guy, I have credit cards. But the proper use of credit cards is to use them like prepaid cards. Okay, what do I mean? The normal way people use credit cards is they go and they buy something which they have no cash in the bank for. And that's how they get into debt. Because technically they're borrowing the money of their bank.
Borrowing future money.
Borrowing future money, okay. Now, what you do is, here's how I use credit cards. Okay, I have a budget. Say my monthly expenses are $2,000, $3,000, let's say $3,000. Okay, it's already budgeted for, and there's already income to support it. So what I'll do is everything that's in my budget, from my electricity to my food, everything, I'll just go and I'll use my credit card to buy all of it. And then as soon as I get the bill, at the end of the month, I just take the cash that was sitting in the bank anyway, and just pay it all off. And that way there's no debt. And in the meantime, what you're doing is you're building your credit history, and number two, you're getting free points. The only reason why you will want to use a credit card is to get the freebies. Okay, that's the only reason. Okay, and to build your credit score for the future. But we've all been able to take airplane flights free and hotel stays and car rentals free because of mileage points. Okay, so there is an advantage. Just don't get credit cards that charge you an annual fee. Okay, you want to get the ones that have no annual fees. All right. So, what are your thoughts on that? Yes.
They say that when you pay with plastic, you tend to spend more.
Yes.
Which I find to be true.
Okay.
Versus when you pay with cash, it hurts more.
Yes. And that is
you want to spend money.
And that's actually Dave Ramsey's point. He says cut up your credit cards because it's a temptation. Now, in order to use credit cards properly, it does require self-discipline. And if you're not disciplined enough to do it, then don't use credit cards. Only use it if you're disciplined enough. Right? So, okay, now, yes.
I have another two.
Yes.
I learned this from a class, credit card once.
Okay.
I was shopping for a low interest APR interest rate credit card.
Yes.
For the least amount and for the lowest interest rate, the lowest fees, and the lowest time.
Okay.
So I received something in the mail saying, oh yeah, you can borrow this much for 0% APR for up to 12 months. And the interest would be, or the fees would be 5% or $5 or whatever is higher. So I called them up and I said, hey, so-and-so is giving me this interest, 4% interest, can you do better? I still want to do business with you, can you do better than they? And one company said, no, we don't do that. So I called another one, and another company said, yeah, we can do that. But if I hadn't asked, she wouldn't have given it to me. I said, why didn't you tell me that in the beginning? She goes, because you didn't ask. So,
ask, and you shall be given. But here's a point to be made with, if you're using credit cards properly, actually the APR, all of that is irrelevant. Because at the end of the month, you're going to pay it off in full and there'll be no interest charges. So the only thing that will be relevant is whether or not there's an annual fee. But you can get a credit card that charges 2,000% interest, and it'll be fine.
because you're paying it off every month.
Because you're paying it off every month, there's no balance for them to charge interest on. So credit cards used properly do not even, yes.
The dangerous thing about credit cards, though, is if you fall into a hole and you can't pay it off, because unlike a traditional loan, a credit card has a daily,
you're bringing up good
a
points.
daily accrued interest rate versus a monthly or quarterly.
Yes.
So if I take out a loan from a regular bank, most of the time it's the monthly compounded interest rate. Whereas if I do it with a credit card and I'm over 30 days, it's a daily compounded rate.
Right. So the idea is the proper use of credit cards incur no interest, but to be safe, there might be a month where for some reason you are not able to pay the full balance. In that case, it's best that you go ahead and have a card that has the lowest interest rates and all that.
Right. I did mine too. My credit union, I have to wait 12 days to pay on my loan. Otherwise, if I pay earlier than the 12th of the month,
You get an early payment penalty.
it doesn't go towards my regular monthly payment.
Oh.
Yeah. Whereas if I do a credit card, they could care less about when I make the payment. So for me, I found that it was easier to use my credit card than to use my loan for my credit union. They were making more money off of me than my credit card was.
But your credit union probably wasn't charging you a daily compounded rate, because what the credit card company does is every single day that you have a balance on it that you're not paying off on, they charge you interest on the principal, and that carries over every day. Whereas the credit union will do it about every 30-day cycle.
Right, and I understood that. And in my situation, it was cheaper
Oh yeah.
Yeah, way cheaper to go with the credit card than with my credit card, because I was able to pay it off every week. Whereas there, it's like you gotta wait until the 12th of the month to make your first payment if you want it to be credited for your monthly payment. So when I found that out, I was like, no way, that's how they're getting their interest.
Yeah, you probably had an early payment penalty, is what it was.
Yeah, and I didn't realize.
Yeah, you gotta look at those when you're, because a lot of places, if you ask them, you know, they have to tell you if there's an early repayment penalty.
Okay, good discussion, good discussion. Let's go to number 6, the one that many have been waiting for. Mortgages and big loans. Okay, this is the biggie. Now, there are many different types of mortgages out there, right? We're going to stick to what is called the conventional loan, the conventional mortgage. A conventional mortgage is what is called an amortized loan. Well, what does that mean? What does amortized mean? Go ahead, Mike.
I don't know how to explain it. Your interest payments are based on how much you're paying on your principal every month, and it depreciates. The ratio changes over time.
So
So
in the beginning, I think you pay less towards your principal, more towards your interest, and towards the end of your loan, you're going to be paying more.
Right. And we're gonna talk about that. But what is the definition of amortization? Auntie Dita, you used to work in mortgages, right? Could you tell us what does amortize mean?
It's breakdown throughout the life of the loan. If you want it for 15 or 30 years.
Okay. I'm really glad we have a loan officer here, a former loan officer. This helps us a lot because, I'm not an expert at this thing. Amortized simply means that you are taking a lump sum cost and you are paying it over regular increments for a fixed period of time. So basically, if you're taking, let's say a conventional mortgage like she mentioned, generally they are either 15-year or 30-year. That is the most common, okay? So a conventional loan, you're required like a 20% down payment on the house, and then 80% of it is what you take the mortgage for, okay? So let's assume that you're buying a house and you need to borrow $300,000, okay? And let's just say that the going rate is 5%, and you're amortizing it over 30 years. So these are the number of months, right? So 30 years, 12 months, that's 360 months. So this is month 1, and month 360 is supposed to be at the end here. Okay, so when they talk about amortized loans, it's simply spreading the cost over time. And you're paying fixed payments, a set amount. Now, what's really interesting about amortized loans, okay, this goes into, does anyone know the difference between simple compounding and, sorry, what is it? Yeah, simple loans, simple interest loans, and compounding interest loans. Does anyone know the difference? Yes.
A simple loan, if I take out, let's say $100 in a loan, and I owe 10% interest on it, it doesn't matter how much I pay at any given payment, I'm going to owe 10% of the $100 at the end of the loan. A compounded loan is, like I was saying with the credit card, whatever I owe after my payments, I get interest on that, and then anything I didn't pay with the interest, I get charged interest on that interest.
Right.
So it's why with a credit card, if you pay the minimum monthly payments on it, you end up paying it off in 20 years, and you owe like 10 times more than what you borrowed on it.
Right. So basically, a simple interest loan is you take the interest rate, you multiply it by the amount you're buying, and that's how much interest you're going to pay.
Like your house, you're going to end up paying for it about 7 times by the time you get done with that 30 years if you just pay the minimum.
Okay, so let's go to that. Even though mortgages are not compound interest loans, there is a compounding effect, and it's seen in what you guys just described. Okay, so say you took out the $300,000 and you're paying, your mortgage payment is $1,600 a month. Okay, every month for the next 360 months. Now, what happens here is your first payment on your first month will be $1,600, but of that $1,600, about only less than $400, let's say $350 of that $1,600 is going to pay down your principal. The way mortgages are designed, the banks want their profit up front, right? So they're going to get this here, okay, from your first payment, second payment. The more payments you make, the more will apply to your principal. But for the first, few years of your mortgage, the bulk of your monthly payments is just going to be interest. It's the cost of borrowing money. Okay. Now, why is that important? Because it helps us understand how to strategize on paying the least amount of interest. So, say you're doing this. Okay, like Mike said, at the end of the term, you're going to be paying maybe almost double, triple more than what the house, the original amount was. Okay, so what you want to do with your mortgages is what Dave Ramsey suggests, and that's pay it off early. Because when you pay it off early, there's less interest. Okay, now how do you do that?
Well, if you can afford a 15-year loan and you decide to opt to do a 30-year loan, the amount you owe every month tends to be lower, so maybe you can make 2 payments a month instead of the 1.
Okay. Let's talk about.
And then if you have a 4% interest rate, you're really paying about 2% by the time the loan's done.
Let's take another loan, just as an example. Let's say that you're taking $200,000 out at 4% for 30 years. Okay. $200,000 in 30 years, this is the amount of interest you will have paid total. Okay, on top of the $200,000. Okay, so all in all, you will have paid $343,000 back. Okay, now if you pay it in 15 years, this is your interest. Cutting the time frame and paying it off early saves you a tremendous amount in interest. The problem is a lot of people don't pay it off early because they want shorter monthly or smaller monthly payments. In order to pay this off sooner, you have to make what is called extra mortgage payments. Which means in a situation like this, your first check of $1,600, you issue it like regular. This percent will be given in interest, that's in principal. And then because you did your budget, okay, and you created savings, you take some of that savings and you write an extra check. And you write on the bottom of the check to principal, right? And what they'll do is they'll apply it here instead of here. And when you're paying down the principal, because interest is charged on the principal, if the principal gets smaller, the interest gets smaller. Okay, so that's the way you accelerate the mortgage. Okay, so again, it all goes back to the B word, budget, right? That's why I stressed it so much in church, because it's actually all there that the power, for your financial life is. Now, what are your thoughts about this? Anyone want to share who has experience with mortgages? Let's share. What are your situations right now? Everyone, don't all jump out of it at once. Well, okay, while you're thinking about it, let's talk a little bit more. Something to consider with loans. You have what is called an interest rate, and as was mentioned many times before, an APR. Whenever you look at loans being advertised, you will see these two numbers, and they will be different. Can someone tell me what they mean? What does APR stand for? 100%?
Percentage rate.
Oh, yeah, she said 100% interest. Annual percentage rate. Yes. Okay. An interest rate is simply the interest rate on the loan. The annual percentage rate, does anyone know what the difference is between the two? Not numerically, like, Auntie Dita, maybe you can tell us. Help.
The interest rate is, okay, the annual is, let me go. Annual, for the year.
Okay.
Okay, so it doesn't, there's fixed rates and adjustable rates. But the annual percentage rate is the overall for the year.
Okay.
I think that's how we want.
By the way, again, there are different types of mortgages. You have ARMs, adjustable rate mortgages. We're not talking about those. Whatever you do not get an ARM.
Yeah.
You can get a leg, just don't get an arm. So ARMs are out. That's why I'm not even discussing them, because they are complicated things, and you don't want to get stuck with them. So we're doing a conventional. So APR, annual percentage rate, simply means that, you know, when you take out a mortgage, the interest rate is what they're charging you in interest on the principal. But there are other charges that the bank throws on. There's what you call origination fees. Okay, there's closing costs, there's all kinds of things they tack on. Okay, when you take all of those fees and you add them to the total cost, and then you divide by the number of months or the year, you get the APR. So the APR is the interest rate plus all the fees that are being tacked on. Okay, so you will always see that the APR is higher than the interest rate. Okay, does anyone have a mortgage here? Okay, so when you were shopping for your mortgage, did you notice a big difference in these numbers? Or what was your...
I don't know. I usually look at the annual percentage yield, because the annual percentage yield is pretty close to what you're actually going to pay. I just kind of ignore the other ones.
Okay, wow, he brought in another term. Okay. Annual percentage yield.
APR can be kind of misleading too, because it doesn't factor in everything that the annual percentage yield will.
Okay. We would, yeah, okay, wow. Okay, let's skip annual percentage yield for a moment, because that brings in a whole new thing. Okay, so when you're looking at mortgages, what you want to do is try and find the mortgage that has the lowest APR and the lowest interest rate. That is the ideal situation. But you may not be able to find that. What you might find is a low APR, which would be a low total cost of the loan, but a high interest rate. Okay, which would be they'll get more of your monthly payment. Or you might find it the other way around, where you have a low interest rate, but a high APR. Okay, so you're gonna have to kind of do some math with these mortgage calculator thingies and find out which is the best for you. That's why these mortgages things are so hard, because it's complicated, really. But generally, what you want to do is think about the time that you're going to hold on to the house. if you're going to hold on to the house for the next 30 years and finish out the mortgage, what you want to focus on the most is the APR, because that'll be the total cost of the loan after 30 years. But if you plan to just be in your house for a few years and sell it, then you want to pay more attention to the interest rate. Okay, so even if the total cost of loan is high, it's okay because you're not going to have the house that long. But if your interest rate can be lower, you want a lower interest rate so that during these few first years that you're holding the house, you won't have to pay as much interest. Do you see what I mean? Okay, but the point is, all in all, do the best you can to pay your house off early. It saves you the headache. Again, the least principle. Least amount of money for the least interest for the least amount of time. You follow those 3 L's, you'll be good. Any other questions? Okay. An argument we hear a lot, at least I hear a lot, from people is, Pastor, my mortgage is my tax shelter. Have you heard that?
Yeah.
Okay, and because I can deduct the interest portion of my payments
For
or
now.
my mortgage, it lowers my taxable income, and it keeps me from paying more taxes. So why would I want to pay my mortgage off early when I'm actually saving money in taxes? Okay, have you heard that one before? Okay, well, what are your thoughts?
That's not true.
Okay, well, why?
Well, when you look at this picture, this graph, and it clearly shows you when you pay it off in a shorter amount of time, you're actually paying much, much less interest.
Yes.
Yeah, but see, in 30 years, I'm also deducting $143,000 off of my taxes as well. So my taxable income goes down $143,800. But the danger in that is the fact that the government's been talking about getting rid of the mortgage interest deduction. So then you get stuck with the $143,000 with no return.
But also, there's a difference between a tax deduction and a tax credit. Okay, a tax deduction just lowers your taxable income. It's not a one-to-one ratio. So in other words, you'll be saving this much in interest by paying your house off early. Okay, but if you actually do the math, what will end up happening is you can deduct this amount from your taxable income, but your total savings will actually be more if you pay off the house early.
I'm going to say it depends on how you do your taxes too, because if you plan your taxes and you using that to get to the top of your tax bracket, whereas if I didn't have that deduction, I know I might be at the bottom of my next tax bracket, then I'm actually paying more to be in the same tax bracket as someone who's making a lot more than me too. So it goes in towards your whole tax plan. You have to take a look at where you are within your bracket to make sure that you're at the top of your bracket, because you never want to be at the bottom, because you're going to be paying almost the same amount as somebody at the top of that bracket.
Again, lots more details there, and that's why the tax planning part comes into your financial plan. It'd be helpful to have someone, a tax advisor, to help you with that.
Especially with the new tax code. It's like the first year that we're in the new tax code, and it hasn't changed in like 40 years.
There's a lot of legislation that's uncertain at this point. But anyway, everybody get the general idea? Okay. So, do you have any questions about mortgages? So we covered the definition of credit and debit. We looked at good debt, bad debt. The general advice for borrowing can be summarized in one word, which is least. Okay, we looked at our FICO score. What's a good FICO score? Right, 800 plus. Okay. How to use credit cards properly, use them only for budgeted items. Mortgages and other big loans, do as best you can to find the lowest APR and the lowest interest rate, and again, the lowest time. Pay it off early, okay? And the way you do pay it off early is by creating savings through your budget. Yes?
If we have time, can we discuss leases?
Leases.
Like if you're wanting to buy a car on a lease.
Oh, okay. Yeah, why don't we give that a few minutes? Leasing. Anybody here lease anything? I've never done it. I really don't know much about it. What can you tell us about leasing?
Don't do it.
Don't do it.
Yeah, because it's basically at the end of your term, you still don't own it. You're just renting it. So it's like having a rental apartment. You're not getting equity into it. You're just paying off someone else's mortgage. So if I went out and leased a car at the end of my lease term, I'd give the car back to whoever I took it from. So if I went down to the Honda dealership, I got a lease. I'm paying $300-400 a month on my lease. At the end of my term, I give it back. I got nothing out of it except for I got to drive a car for 12 months or whatever.
Yeah.
Now some people like it because some people want a new car every 12 months, and so they're not tied down to something. But once again, you're giving somebody else money, and you're not getting a whole lot in return other than I get to borrow it.
Right. I remember from Dave Ramsey's stuff, he was actually saying that maybe the APR or how they figured the financing of that portion is actually higher. It's more higher than if you were to actually buy it, but he didn't really go into great depth on that, how it's figured out. It's kind of complicated.
Yeah, leasing is just another form of renting,
Yeah.
really. And almost all financial people advise against it.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't know the details of it. I just know that it's pretty much as you mentioned.
Well,
Most people say
it's like, like I said with an apartment. If I rent an apartment at the end of whatever and I decide to move, it's not like I have anything I get back out of the $15,000 I paid into it, right? So
Right.
I was my first year here, I was renting a house. I think I was paying about $2,700 a month. So I figured out at the end of a year, I was giving somebody $40,000, and I got nothing out of it other than I got to live in a house for a year. Whereas if I had bought a house when I first got here, I would have had $40,000 in equity, minus the interest payments. That if I were to move, I could sell it and then I'd get something back on what I put into it. I mean, it may be less because of closing costs and everything else, but you still get something back for what you put into it.
Okay.
Okay. Does anyone else have any questions? I mean, there's a lot here, It's 8:30. Do you want to wrap it up here, or do you want to spend a moment or two for debt investment financing? Okay, let's do 5 minutes here. So debt for investment. There's different types of debt for investment. Okay, first of all, what does this mean? It means you're borrowing money to produce money in the future, right? So an example of debt investing would be like a business loan, okay? So you don't have money to start your business, so you're going to take out a business loan, okay? Another example is you want to buy a rental property. So you take out a investment mortgage loan to buy the rental property. This has its pros and its cons. The thing that I can tell you is, before you start doing this stuff and tinkering with using debt for investment, protect your personal assets. A lot of people, you can do it without, but for example, with a business, there are different structures of business. The most common one that's easiest, that everyone understands, is what is called a sole proprietorship. What does that mean? It means basically you're the owner, worker, employee, boss of that business. It's all one and the same. It's you, okay? And the business is inseparable from your personal finances. Okay, it's one and the same. Okay, then you have different other structures, and the more you go along, the more distance is created between the business and your personal finances. So you would have next what is called an LLC. What does that stand for?
Limited liability.
Limited liability company, right? Okay, then you have an LLP, limited liability partnership. And the limited liability, okay, part of that term means that your personal assets, when you take loans and you do business and you get sued or you incur debt, there's a wall between your personal finances and the business's finances. So what affects the business does not fully affect your personal finances. So your liability is limited. It's limited to the amount of personal funds that you invested in the business. Okay? Then you go into corporations. There's C Corps and S Corps and all of these corpses. Okay? I don't know what they all mean, but the idea is, if you start using debt for business purposes, all I could advise is before you start doing that, seek legal protection of your personal financial assets, so that should whatever transactions affect your business, it would not put your personal finances at risk. Okay, so look into business structures. You would consult a lawyer or whoever to advise you on these things. There are small business loans and things that actually are dependent upon your personal finances. That you have to be careful with. There's also investment mortgage loans that you can take that are based on your personal finances. My thing there is only do this if you are pretty sure that you will have income to back it up. Okay, so for example, there's a house in New Jersey that I like, okay? There's people who want to rent it, okay? Already there. Yeah, I'm not going to talk about my personal situation. Let's say that okay, so let's say that we're here in Waipahu, right? And for sure, there are people I know who are good renters. They've been renting in other places, and you know them pretty well, and they really, really want to rent from you, and they're actually willing to put up some money to hold a spot if you were to have a rental place for them. If that were the case, I would go to a mortgage lender, a bank. I would get a loan. I would see if I can even get a no down payment loan, even if the interest is high. But most likely I'd have to get an investment mortgage loan. And then I would take that and I would buy the building, the apartment building, okay? And then since people already gave me money to hold their spot, I'm gonna go and I'm gonna put them in there already. And so from the first month, I already have income generation. Okay, so what that's going to do is that's going to pay my loan off. And even if the interest is high, it's okay because I'm not paying the interest. It's my tenants who are paying the interest. Now, what I do have to do is have reserve cash on the side so that if one of my tenants don't come through, I've got reserves to cover the difference. Okay? And then the rental income that's coming in, instead of paying that all towards the mortgage, I'm going to have to set some aside into a building fund, okay, to pay for repairs and all the things that landlords need to pay for. But the idea is, I'm using debt for investment. And if the odds are pretty good that the income coming in is going to cover the expense going out, go for it. Just make sure you build up the reserves to cover gaps. Okay, and should it come the time that your expense may start exceeding your income, sell the apartment. You know? So there are ways around this. This all depends on what is called your risk tolerance, which was brought up. Risk tolerance is a personality thing. Okay, financial advisors have this little questionnaire thing you can take. There are people who are naturally risk takers, who they're like, yeah, let's do this, we can do this. And they go and they become the next Mark Zuckerberg, or they become the next, you know, Bill Gates or whatever. And then you have the rest of us who are more risk averse, where we're not as risky, okay? And so we don't necessarily jump right into this. I'm sort of risk averse, which is why I haven't done this yet. I've only looked into it.
I think Bill Gates is a bad example, because Microsoft's actually a bad corporation when you look at it, because their cash to debt ratio is too high.
And also they're a monopoly pretty much in their field, so yeah.
They don't take a lot of risks, because if you have a lot of cash on hand, you can pay off your debt. You know, you don't really want to have a 1-to-1 ratio of cash to debt in a corporation, because then you're not expanding, you're not investing wisely.
Right. Okay, so does anyone have any questions? You can do a lot of research into debt for investing. Another form of it, if you're into stock investing, is what you call buying stocks on margin, which is you loan money to buy stocks, hoping that the stock is going to appreciate, and as soon as it does, you sell it, and you pay back the loan, and you have profit. That's what you call leveraged stock trading. I advise against it. I tried it and I got burned.
Oh yeah.
As I learned God's ways, the worldly ways burnt me. So I'm like, okay, enough. Anyways, okay, so we've reached the end of our discussion. It's 8:45. I think we'll let you go home now. But are there any other thoughts or questions? I mean, what did you think of this discussion? Was it fruitful? Was it helpful?
Yes.
Okay. So feel free again to ask more questions. I mean, I'm not an expert in this stuff, but you know, if you have questions, we'll try and find experts, you know, to answer the question. And of course, that means Dave Ramsey, right? Okay. Any other comments, questions? All right, let's stand for closing prayer. Our dear, gracious, loving Heavenly Father, we thank you, Lord, we thank you for your gift of salvation and making us stewards. Stewards, Lord, of wealth that you've entrusted to us as believers. And now, Lord, as we seek to implement these principles and to live good stewardship out in our daily life, we ask for wisdom. We ask for guidance. We ask, Lord, that your Holy Spirit be with us to guide us every step of the way. May we do everything to glorify you and to just be the stewards you want us to be, so that we can hear those words when you return. Well done, my good and faithful servant. You have been faithful in a few things, so you will be in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord. And so, Lord, it's those words that we close with tonight. May those words be in our heart and in our mind as we go about your business and ours. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you. And have a good night.